Welcome to the PHP Essential Training Series. I'm Mike King, your host, and in this tutorial we're going to talk about the if-else statement in PHP. The next conditional statement we'll discuss is the if-else statement. This control statement allows you to execute one or more statements when the condition is true and execute one or more other statements when the condition is false. The key to this statement is that unless the condition is explicitly met, the code in the else condition will be executed. The statements after the else condition can be considered the default statements in this particular conditional statement. These will execute whenever the condition in the parentheses are not met. The if-else statement is another very popular conditional statement in most programming languages. The standard syntax is, as you see on your screen, we have an if condition, and if that condition is true, it executes the statements that fall in the curly braces. If that condition is not true, it goes to the else and then executes the conditions in the else portion of the curly braces. So it's very similar to our if condition, but in this case, it always executes the else statements if the condition is not met. And again, our program flow, we flow into the conditional block. If the condition is true, it executes the code that's part of the true statement, and then it drops back into program flow. And if the condition is false, it always executes the else condition that's inside those curly braces. So whatever statements or functions we put between the curly braces for else are executed if the condition is false. Just as in the if statement, it's very important that you watch the syntax very closely. Forgetting a semicolon, a curly brace, and opening or closing parentheses will cause errors in the execution, and that's true with almost all programming languages. And like the if statement, PHP uses Boolean concepts of true and false when determining whether to execute the statements in the curly braces. If the condition is true, the statements are executed. If it is false, then the else condition statements are executed. So there's always something in this conditional statement that's going to be executed, whether it's true or false. We're always going to have statements either with the true portion or with the false portion. So let's move into our development environment and work through some exercises on the if-else statement in PHP. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and drop out of our presentation. Let's drop into our development environment. I want to confirm that we have our Apache server up and running. And we do. Let's go ahead and bring up Google Chrome, which will be our web browser for this particular exercise. And I'm going to go ahead and bring up Sublime Text 2 as my text editor. I've got my standard skeleton HTML5 document open on our stage. And this is going to be very similar to what we've done in the previous exercise. I'm going to go ahead and open up my PHP blocks, close my PHP blocks, and let's go ahead and set up a couple of variables. I'm just going to have, again, variable A that will be equal to 23. Let's go ahead and set up variable B equal to James. Variable C will be equal to 25 or 24, 25. Variable D will be equal to Peter. And that'll be good for now. Then I'm going to go ahead and open up my conditional statement, my if. So if I open and close my parentheses, and let's just say if A is equal to 20, and then we're going to open and close our curly braces just as we've done in the previous exercise, but then right after the closing curly brace for the if statement, I'm going to write else and open and close another set of curly braces. That's the standard syntax for an if-else statement. We have our if condition right there. Then we've got our curly braces for the code if that is true. If that's not true, we go into what's called the else condition, open and closing curly braces. Then we have the code that's going to execute in the event that the condition is not met. So right here, we're just going to say echo, and we'll put in the condition was met, just so that you know we actually got into the conditional statement, and that with a semicolon. Let's go ahead and put in another echo, and we'll put in a line break, just so that we can keep our code clean. And I'm just going to go ahead and copy this. I'm going to come down into my else condition, paste that in place, and I'm just going to say the condition was not met. Then I'm going to come outside the conditional statement and just echo back in program flow. So we know when we're in the actual program flow and outside the conditional statement. And again, it's just for the sake of our demonstration. And actually, I'm going to put in a break statement here also, just so that we've got a break between all those lines in the event we get a bunch of stuff in our browser window. Let's go ahead and save all those changes. I'm going to do a save as and save this as exercise file 2. And let's go back and look at what we've done here. So I'm asking, is A equal to 20? If that evaluates to true, in other words, if it is equal to 20, it's going to execute this code. If it's not equal to 20, it's going to execute this code. And then we're going to drop in a normal program flow. Let's go back and refresh our browser window and load up exercise 2. And you'll see that the condition was not met. So we're actually in the else portion of the statement. And then we're back in regular program flow. So if I were to make the variable A20 and save that change and refresh our browser window, now the condition was met, and then we fall back into normal program flow. This works very, very similar to what we discussed with the if statement. So again, very, very similar formatting, very similar execution. We can use a lot of the same operators, in fact, all the same operators that we used in the previous exercise. So if I want to say is A less than or equal to 20, and we'll make this 25. So we're asking now, is A less than or equal to 25? If that evaluates to true, which it will, because A is 20, then this portion of the code will execute and we'll drop back into normal document flow or normal program flow. Let's go ahead and save that, refresh our browser window. It is true. If I make A 30, it's going to evaluate to not true because it's not less than or equal to 25. Refresh the browser window. The condition was not met. We're back in normal document flow. So all the same operators that we used in the previous example for the if statement, we can use it in this example. I do want to add something else to this though, because there's other things that we can do in these conditional expressions. So let's look at some other operators that we can use inside these conditional expressions. I could also put an or, which is my two pipe symbols. And I could say, is B, so I'm just going to go with variable B, equal to James. Now this adds a whole other evaluation to our conditional statement. So I'm asking, is A less than or equal to 25, which we know is going to evaluate to false, or is B equal to James? By asking the or statement, now this is going to evaluate to true. So even though this is false, this will be true and it's going to evaluate to true. So that code will actually run. Let's go ahead and save that change. Do a save as. Let's save this as exercise 3. Test that in our browser window and it says the condition was met. And we're back in normal program flow. So because one of these two conditions is true, it evaluates and runs the true section, or else it would evaluate the false section. I could actually change that or to an and by using the ampersand sign. Now I've got to have both these conditions be true in order to execute this code. So let's go ahead and save that change. Do a save as. I'm going to save that as number 4. Refresh our browser window. Let's make sure we got all our saves. I got to go back and pull up exercise number 4. And now the condition was not met. And the reason it was not met is because I ask, is A less than or equal to 25? No, it's not. And is B equal to James? This portion is true, but the first portion was false. If I were to turn this back to 20 and save that change, now they both evaluate to true because A is less than or equal to 25 and B does equal James. So now when I refresh the browser window, the condition was met. So again, using those and ors, we can actually add a lot of complexity to these conditional statements. So for instance, if I was looking for a user registration, and I could have here, is the username equal to this? And is the password equal to this? And I could be pulling both of these from a database. And if both of those conditions are met, then I could actually have the code drop into running a different section of our code that pertains to our members. If they're not true, I could actually bring up a registration form, or I could send them to a section of the website that was not for members. So you can see where this can become very, very interesting in the way that our program flows based on these conditional statements. And that's why we use these. I mean, these give us a lot of flexibility in how we write our code, and how certain portions of the code are accessed by other portions of the code. So like we done in the previous exercise, we could actually have a mixed here. Let's go ahead and add that variable e, and we'll make him equal to a number 22 inside quotation marks. So in other words, based on our last tutorial and based on the if statement that we went through, you know that that's going to evaluate as a value of 22, but it's a string data type. It's not an integer data type. So if I were to make a 22, let's go ahead and save those changes. I'm going to save this as exercise number 5. Let's go back and load exercise 5 in our browser window. And now I were to say if a is, let's go with our triple equal signs because now we want an identical match. If a is 22 and b, well, let's go with e, and e is equal to 22, are they going to match? So let's go ahead and save that change. I want you to think about that before we refresh our browser window. I'm going to go ahead and refresh the browser window, and it was not met. And the reason it was not met is what we discussed about once before. When we're looking at the get data types, again, E is not an exact match because this is an integer data type, this is a string data type. If I were to take that out, save that change, refresh our browser window, now it is a match. So again, you can really play with how these work inside our conditional statements, and you can get some very complex conditions met based on how you're writing your code. The key takeaway from the if-else statement is whenever we don't evaluate to true inside our condition, so if this ever evaluates to false, this code in the else section will always execute. So it's the default execution in the event that we get a false inside of our condition. And it's very handy. I mean, it allows us to do a lot of things as we're programming. You're going to see much more if-else or else-thens or if-else than you're going to see in most programming if statements. You're going to see a lot more if-else than just ifs. And again, as we work through the future tutorials, you're going to see me use a lot of these in the tutorials. You're going to see that they can become pretty complex, but I want you to have a good understanding of the basics of how these conditional statements work. All right, so let's drop out of the development environment and go back into our presentation for a quick review of what we've covered. And inside this tutorial, we looked at the conditional if-else statement. Conditional statements are an important part of programming. We discussed that with the if statement. The key to take away from this, the else code will always execute when the condition evaluates to false. So whatever we've put inside the parentheses for that if statement, if it evaluates false, we're always going to execute the code that's in the else statement. In other words, everything that's in the curly braces after else. Comparison operators that we looked at the comparison operator again, the double equal sign. We looked at the OR operator, which is the two pipe symbols, and normally that's right above your enter key. It's a shift above the enter key on your keyboard. We looked at the AND operator, the two ampersand signs. We looked at the less than or equal to operator, and we looked at the identical operator, which is the three equal signs, which means that not only is the value identical in value, but the data types are also identical. So again, keep in mind, whenever we use an if-else statement, the else code will always execute when the condition evaluates to false.